Anthony Casablanca is my guest today, and we are going to be talking about grief in the workplace because returning to work while you're grieving can be one of the most difficult things to do. So Anthony has a very interesting background that has led to the work that he and his brother are doing today, and he can explain it way better than I can. So welcome, Anthony. Thank you very much for joining us.
Oh, thanks so much. It's a privilege to be here. Thanks.
So tell us a little bit about the work that you're doing and why you feel it's so important to do it.
Sure. So this is a culmination of a couple of years worth of research and work. My brother Guy is a licensed funeral director, a duly licensed funeral director. Spent years in funeral service, helping families through the funeral process, grieving families through the funeral process. And has had lots of exposure to, and hears more often than you would believe from family members about how my work environment is not helping me. They are complicating this either through their leave policies or an inflexible boss or just not understanding what I'm going through. He hears that a lot in the interactions that he has with families. And so his funeral background and his background in dealing with grieving families, and my background, I spent 31 years with Hillenbrand Industries, and 28 of those was with they own a Batesville casket company, which is the largest casket provider in the world. And so I have a funeral service background from that side, but more importantly, a leadership background. In those 31 years, I was in a whole host of leadership roles. The last 3 roles that I had, spanning probably 10 or 12 years, was as the vice president of human resources, and then I was their vice president of supply chain, and finally I was president of a smaller operating company. So we decided to come together and address this issue from a very broad perspective. Because grief is not just driven by the loss of a loved one, it's driven by any loss that sort of reshapes your reality, your current reality. And so when you look at grief that way, you are right. There are a lot of people returning to work, be it they were at work Friday and there's some emotionally traumatic event that happens over the weekend and they come in Monday, or there's some prolonged thing, right, where there's actually a gap in their work where they're off for a week because of a funeral or whatever, and they're coming back to work on Monday. But there are a lot of people. You can get to a very large number without throwing a lot of things in the category. But if you think about things like divorce and cancer diagnosis and opioid addictions and Alzheimer's diagnosis, just to name a few, you can quickly get to, millions of people coming to work every day in some stage of grief. And Guy and I decided that there was a gap there, particularly from a leadership perspective, right? Mm-hmm. So while what we do isn't going to change what that person is feeling, we hope that we can show leaders how they can help grieving people integrate into the workplace and excel while they're grieving, by being flexible and understanding better how to lead them and what grief really means. So that's what we're working on. That's what we're trying to do.
So let me ask you this: in all of your 30-some years of leadership
Mm-hmm.
in corporate America, how much grief training have you had?
Absolutely none.
Yeah.
Absolutely none. And I suspect
that's amazing.
So not only wasn't I trained, but the organization didn't have any process for really dealing with this either, right? And we are finding that is true in most organizations, right? Even the progressive thinking organizations, so the folks who have adapted their bereavement leave to give you 20 or 30 days off that you can take however you want, or have flexible work policies, or emotional well-being benefits and counseling and all those kinds of things. Because there's very we would say no one playing in this space, no one addressing this. Even those progressive thinking companies have no process in place to train their leaders on how to deal with this. So if you happen to work for a leader who does this naturally, right, can adapt his style or her style naturally, you get treated very well and you think very highly of how your organization handled you, and the people around you feel the same way. If you happen to work for somebody who that's not their natural tendency, then you struggle, and the people around you also struggle because they're like, wow, that we should be more understanding. We should help this person, but they don't know what to do either. So yeah, we're finding that the fact that I wasn't formally trained in this is not unusual. There really is nothing out there from a leadership perspective on how leaders should engage in the grieving process to help the grieving employee excel when they come back to work.
Right. And you know what? And, a lot of it to me is common sense, but I say that only because I have suffered deep grief, and I know what to put into place because I know what I would have wanted, and
Right.
So you tend to do better. But so many people in leadership, a lot of times this is their first, go around in leadership, which means that they're probably going to be a younger person, which means they're probably not even going to have life experiences equal to the depths of grief that people are feeling.
Right.
You've got a lot of young leaders out there that, have never had a major death, have not even been married, let alone gone through a divorce, whose parents perhaps aren't old enough to, have issues like Alzheimer's or, other conditions
Right.
that are led to, maybe an older person's kind of disease. And so they just haven't been in the stage of life where it starts getting tumultuous.
Right. Right.
So
Exactly.
they're captaining a ship, but they're not understanding, so much of it. And so that being said, these skills are so important because the damage of not doing it in the right way can really affect the bottom line.
Right. Yes. In fact, one of our pieces of research, the Grief Recovery Institute, did a study back in 2003, which they've updated or are in the process of updating. And when you define grief the way we defined it here a little bit earlier in this discussion, more broadly than just the loss of a loved one, they found that the impact of grieving employees in the workplace costs U.S. companies about $75 billion annually in lost productivity. And the irony in all of this is, so not only have leaders not been trained and they don't know how to deal with this, and they're young, right? Because all companies now, all larger companies, do an awful lot with talent matrices and high potential, high performing individuals, and they're looking for younger and younger and younger people in their succession planning and putting them in bigger and bigger roles. Not only haven't they been trained, but the organizations themselves tend they tend to wear the badge of hey, we're performance driven, which is a very good thing if you are investing in the company, and sometimes even if you're a customer, but certainly if it's a publicly traded company and Wall Street's involved, that's very much in favor. But that also tends to mean that your culture likely is not to a point where people feel safe in coming to work and being at work and admitting that they're struggling. And so you've got that dynamic playing out as well. So you have an employee who is in a stage of grief, pick one of the five, doesn't matter, and their performance begins to slip. The culture of the organization has not evolved to the point in many organizations where that employee feels comfortable raising their hand and going, hey, I am really struggling and I need help. You got a leader who's never been trained and actually gets rewarded for removing underperforming talent, or at least addressing underperforming talent. And so you get this whole dynamic playing out that results in this void where the leader is not addressing what the needs of the employee and is actually compounding the grief, because now we're starting to put the person on a performance improvement plan, and we're starting to manage them out of the organization, and just added stress. Exactly.
Piling on.
Right? Yeah. And I don't mean to paint a picture that all organizations do that, but
Right.
certainly there is a gap of awareness here. And at the end of the day, let's face it, dealing with someone who is in one of the stages of grief is awkward. It's emotional. It is
Uncomfortable.
Uncomfortable. That's the word I was looking for. It's very uncomfortable. You don't know what to say. You don't want to say something that's going to make this person get upset or cry. And so even if you're aware of the situation, you don't have the muscle memory, you don't have the experience, as you mentioned, to actually deal with it. And so we have begun to put together a process to take companies through that would at least expose leaders to what's going on, how they should think about this, and actually even give them a model to follow that would help them adapt their leadership to meet the need of not only the grieving person, but frankly, it's applicable to all of their employees' development. And so, yeah, it's a real issue. It's a real issue.
So could you give me just a few tips, and our audience a few tips, of something that is not that difficult to implement that would make a huge difference if they could just walk away with one or two tips today of where to start?
Right. So one is, don't be afraid to engage in the process, right? And that part of leadership is helping your people through difficult times. It's easy to lead in good times, right? Mm-hmm. And those difficult times, by the way, can be created by a company's own initiatives, right? If you think about that, because anytime your sense of the current reality shifts, you feel a sense of loss. So a company that is, especially now, going through layoffs and furloughing people, there's a whole lot of anxiety around that are causing people are wondering if they're next, right? When is this going to end? How is this going to play out? So the company's own initiatives can cause people to enter the stages of grief. So leaders need to engage in this process, right? And they need to not stick their head in the sands and just pretend like everything is normal, right? It's not. And so the first tip would be, don't be afraid to engage, and don't be afraid to sort of get in that awkward moment with the person to really understand what's going on. More than likely, the person will appreciate it, and it will be tearful, potentially, depending on what the situation is. And there may even be other emotions like anger and other things that come out. But at the end of the day, they will probably really appreciate a leader who sits down with them and doesn't just talk about how their performance is slipping, but chooses to seek to understand what's going on and how can we help. The other tip would be to actually lead. Right? To actually lead. Asking the person how they're doing is not good enough, because they're likely going to say, I'm fine, because your company culture has conditioned them to say that, right? And they don't want to appear weak, and they don't want to appear like they need help. And so the second tip would be sort of take control of the situation and lead, right? Don't just ask if they need help. Provide some coaching, some alternatives, right? It's not just, do you need help, but hey, what if we altered your work plan a little bit? And I gave you a little additional help so that, as you're going through whatever, you've got a little bit more time that you can focus on the issues that you're having, as opposed to worrying about this deadline or that deadline. A lot of times leaders they're waiting for the employee to give them the cue that something needs to change. And we miss it. A lot of times as leaders, that never happens because the culture has conditioned people not to come forward like that. And so we miss the cue. And the first time it sort of comes front and center is when a deadline gets missed or an error gets made, or the person rushes out of the room in tears, or they blow up in a meeting because it's all sort of gotten bottled up and they get angry. And it doesn't need to necessarily play out that way if we're in tune. So the first one would be engage. The second one would be actually lead, and sort of lead from the heart, and think about how we could help this person. And the third tip would be involve the team, because the coworkers want to help as well.
Yes.
And they don't know how either. And so by doing that, they will be more than willing to pick up the slack, right, for a given period of time. And they will step back, and you will actually, we believe, and I've experienced it myself, you'll actually see overall morale improve, and engagement improve, and productivity improve, because they realize that the organization means what they say in their vision speech statements and the things that are hung on the wall, that they are actually supporting that with actions when an employee needs a little bit of help. And folks will admire that in the organization and in the leader, frankly.
In the case of death, I think that it's important too to have that conversation before this person comes back to work. Start that conversation before they come back to work, because there are some people that if you don't address it, it's going to make you seem insensitive. But then there are other people who prefer that you don't. Right? They just want, this is where I can come to be normal. So just let me be normal, right? But how do you know if you don't have the conversation?
And so that's a great point, Sherrie. So it should be a conversation, right? It should be a dialogue. You shouldn't just walk in and say, I've decided to rearrange your priorities and take you off these projects, because that actually might send a counter message, which is you even further are isolating this person and don't value them. So it should be a dialogue. It should be very much a conversation, a very compassionate conversation about, look, I understand that, your son has been diagnosed with cancer and you're going to need to spend some time with them. Let's talk about how we can be flexible here, and put together a plan so that the work still gets done. You have time to be with your son. We can adapt as we go along. Let's talk a little bit about what that looks like. I have some ideas, but I would love for your thoughts on this, because ultimately you need to be the one who helps structure this. Perfect, right? That's how this should really play out. And we, in our work, and in our book, which will be out later this summer, we actually do lay out a process that begins to help leaders understand how employees will likely behave and respond through these processes. But I can tell you from all the research we've done, I could give you countless examples of companies that have done it really, really well, and companies that have done it not so well, or I shouldn't say leaders that have not done it quite so well. I can't speak for the entire company, but there's lots of examples of it out there. And we're hoping that with working with people like you and others, that 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 we can change that, and we can kind of make this a bit of a movement that it becomes the norm, that we don't first point to performance, but we actually sit down with the person and say, hey, let's talk about this. I know you're going to be going through a stressful time.
Right.
And unfortunately, the further away you get from those visible events, right? So a death is very visible. You know when somebody experiences a death in their family. You may not know, though, when someone experiences a personal health diagnosis crisis with either a parent or a child, or maybe even themselves. And so, you may not know when somebody's going through a divorce. And so the further removed you get, the more difficult it is to really understand what's going on. And it really starts there, right? It starts with that conversation about, let's talk about this, right? Let's talk about this and how the organization can help you get through this. That's what we would like to see as the starting point.
Well, you also have to create that environment where they feel safe to have that conversation with you. If you are further removed and I just got diagnosed, that I can go in safely to my boss and not have to worry about, is he thinking about replacing me?
Correct.
Is he making plans for my replacement?
Right.
And whatnot. So, it is an uncomfortable conversation, but it needs to happen. And I love the work that you're doing because it's just so important, and you were mentioning, loss of productivity, but then it could be the loss of a good employee who just feels like they were not valued, they were not understood,
Right.
they were not helped after giving so much of what they've given. They received nothing in return, no understanding in return, and just chose to leave.
Correct. Right. And, I don't have any statistics that they're almost impossible to get around, how many employees just stay because they figured that was how the company was going to respond. And I don't want more change in my life, and so I'm not going to leave. How many employees leave on their own because this isn't the company that I want to work for because of the way they didn't treat me, or the way they did treat me. And then the third group is how many of them are good employees, but you wind up managing them out of the organization because they were poor performers.
Right.
And it's, and grief doesn't have a timeline. So
No.
it's not like you can just say, well, in 30 days, this will all improve. Some people grieve for a long time, depending on how complicated the grief is and the level of the emotion, the level of the suddenness and the tragicness of the emotional event that took place. It can, well, and the reality is you grieve forever, right?
You carry the grief somewhere, but it's manageable. You've worked it into your life.
You've learned
how to, you've learned, you've worked through it. And that brings me, back to, yes, you want to move forward, but at the same time, I think as a good leader, you need to step back and evaluate this. Are they in the same perpetual state, 6 months, a year later, that they were in their fresh grief? Then that might, you might have to suggest, you need to evaluate to say, listen, I think you might need more help here.
Yes.
I think that a good leader will also lead them to let them know that, listen, this isn't getting any better for you. And I know there's no timeline, but I know it can be better.
Right.
And so you might need additional support.
Correct.
Have you considered, and so it would be, a good leader would also be aware of, what agencies and what people in their community they can connect them to.
Right. And that should all be part of those initial discussions, right? That's all part of the plan. Again, don't wait, right? Just let the person know that, hey, there are resources available to you. And if you ever think you need them, please come talk to me and we will provide you with a list, or we'll get you pointed in the right direction. It's all about engaging. That's really what this is about. It's all about leaders being willing to engage in their employees' emotional well-being and, to a certain extent, their personal lives. And a lot of times that's not in vogue, right? It's not where leaders, they don't get rewarded for that, or they don't believe they do. But I would tell you that anything you do to help morale, help engagement, help productivity, right? Help talent, retention, all of that, you indirectly do get rewarded for that, because it does manifest itself in your department's results. But yeah, at the end of the day, it's really just about engaging and sort of leading from your heart, and leading the way you would like to be led if you were going through it. Unfortunately, though, most leaders, as you mentioned, don't actually have the experience, even in their own personal life,
Right.
to draw on to say, wow, that was really, really hard. And, we just want to educate people and leaders, companies, on the need for this, right? That it's a good tool to have in your toolkit to help people through this. And part of the process is understanding, where your people are in their current performance, right? Because, maybe Bob is an underperforming guy today anyway, right? He was struggling before the grief. So it doesn't mean that, you have to salvage all people, right?
Right.
Or that, some people, yeah, if they were already a performance problem and now they're going through grief, their performance probably isn't going to get much better. And
Right.
they may wind up being managed out of the organization. And, that's tragic, but that's a reality.
But it also might mean deeper that that's really wasn't the right fit for that person.
Correct.
And it could be the best gift you give someone.
Right. Right. So holding aside the already underperforming person, what we really talk about from a leadership perspective in the book is knowing, if you have people who were performing well or high potentials, when the event happens and they're coming back to work, they likely are not going to behave the same way they did as they did previously. And they're going to need a little bit more support and a little more coaching and a little more engagement, at least at the outset, until you both agree on sort of, when they get their land legs back and can return to the way they were performing before. And that's not necessarily a problem. It's just part of the process, right? It's just part of the process.
Well, I think it's very important work that you and your brother are doing. I think that it's something that belongs in every organization, every business, every school, anywhere where someone has to lead someone else and a team of other people.
Agreed.
Because we're human beings first. They always say, in the era that I grew up, there's business and then there's personal.
Right.
But more and more times, we're at a time right now during COVID where business and personal are living in the same house.
Yes, they
right?
are. Yes,
And we're
are.
seeing more of this, and we're seeing more of this intertwining. And I think that's a good thing, because that we are humans first.
Right. And
then we are professionals, right? But if we lose touch of the human connection, that's where a lot of the problems stem from. So I think it's important work that you're doing. So if people want more information on what you're doing, and they, how can they find out?
Right. So the easiest way would probably be to go to our website, www.griefleaders.com. And you can scroll through the pages. You can read about Guy and I. You can read about what we do, how we do it, what our mission is, what our purpose is, what our values are. You can read a little bit about our book, although the book won't be for sale for another couple of months. You can read a little bit about our book and what the book is about through that website. And then there are also contact forms. So you can reach out to us. And we would absolutely love if people want to and feel open enough to. One of the contacts form is share your return to work grief story. And so we would love to hear from people about their experiences returning to work, or if you're a leader who's had to lead someone that you may not have recognized was in this grief pattern, share your story about what you experienced when you led them and the lessons you've learned. We'd love to see those stories. And then you can also engage us for a free consultation to talk about how we might be able to help your organization and your leaders. The other way would be to go to my LinkedIn page at www.linkedin.com/company/in/Anthony Casablanca which I don't know why that has to be quite that hard, but anyway, that's the LinkedIn page for me personally. And you can learn about what we're doing there as well. And then there is a company page on LinkedIn as well, which is www.linkedin.com/company/griefleaders-LLC.
Okay. We will put all that in the show notes as well so
Cool.
that people can have a direct link to it. But Anthony, thank you very much for spending time with us today. It's been a pleasure getting to know you and getting to know the work that you're doing. It's so important and it's so meaningful to so many people.
Well, I really appreciate that, Sherrie. And as I said at the outset, just humbled, frankly, to be on the podcast and delighted to be able to sort of join forces here and make a difference here, because I think it is important, as you said. And that's what it's really all about, right? Is if we can help some folks through a most difficult time, that's what we all should do. So
Absolutely.
all right, thanks so much.
Okay.